In a dusty town where no man ever brought her flowers, a poor seamstress stitched her days in silence, mocked for her weight, pitied for her kindness. She had no suitors, no dreams left, until a stranger in a fine coat rode into town asking for her by name. She didn't know it yet, but he had crossed battlefields just to thank her. And what happened at the church that Sunday changed everything. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Marian Holloway had learned to make herself smaller in every room, tucking her shoulders in at sewing circles, folding her hands in church pews, lowering her voice so it wouldn't carry, avoiding mirrors like they might echo back the same quiet truth she'd heard her whole life, that she wasn't pretty enough, thin enough, good enough to be chosen. And though she never wept where others could see, her pillow had soaked years of silent longing for a kind word, a hand to hold, a name whispered with love in the dark. Yet even in her loneliness she never hardened, never stopped baking extra loaves for hungry neighbors, never stopped hemming dresses for girls half her size who'd never thank her, because kindness wasn't her strategy, it was her nature. A soft stubbornness passed down from her mother, who once said, "Don't let the world decide your value, child. Let your heart do that." But as the years passed and the dances came and went without her, and the town's eligible men picked smoother waists and louder laughs, Marian folded that heart into her work, stitching comfort into clothes and hope into letters she sent to soldiers whose names she'd never know. Letters filled with poetry, scripture, jokes, anything to warm the dark places. And when the war ended, and the brass bands played and the flags waved, no one thought twice about the quiet seamstress in Alder Creek, whose words had traveled farther than her feet ever had. But someone had noticed. Someone who read her letters by candlelight in foxholes and bomb shelters. Someone who clung to her unsigned words like lifelines. And that man, Grayson Ellington, son of a ranching dynasty with wealth spread wider than the rivers that fed the valley, never forgot the comfort she gave without asking for thanks. And after the war, while others chased applause and land deals, he followed the script of her voice until he found the postmaster who'd remembered her neat cursive. And from there he traced her home. Not the kind of home with marble floors or grand staircases, but a weather-beaten cottage wrapped in vines and laughter from neighbor children she watched for free. And when Grayson rode into Alder Creek wearing a coat too fine for the dust, people stopped and stared. Women straightened their skirts, men glanced sideways, assuming he was here to buy land or invest in cattle. But when he walked past every polished smile and went straight to the shop where Marian was adjusting the waist of a girl's dress, the room fell breathless, and Marian, startled by the shadow in the doorway, stood up with a pin still in her hand, unsure if she was being tricked or dreamed too vividly. But Grayson removed his hat, looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You wrote to me." And when she blinked, confused, he added, "During the war you saved me." And though she shook her head, whispering, "I didn't sign them," he smiled and replied, "But your soul was in every line and I'd know it anywhere." And that was the moment everything changed, not just for Marian, but for the entire town that had convinced itself she was unworthy of romance, as if softness were a flaw and curves a curse. But Grayson saw what they didn't: strength in gentleness, depth in silence, grace in everything she did. And when he asked to court her, people gossiped like hens during a storm, whispering that he was bewitched or playing a cruel joke. And even Marian, used to disappointment, told him gently, "Please don't pretend I'm someone you could love." But he shook his head and told her about the nights her letters kept him from putting a bullet in his brain, how the scent of lilac she'd once mentioned in a poem had carried him through blood and smoke, how every man in his unit listened when he read her words aloud, and how he made a vow that if he survived, he'd find the woman who saved him and give her the life she deserved. And Marian didn't know whether to cry or laugh or run, because hope hurts when it's unexpected. But she let herself believe him, slowly, cautiously, like stepping into warm water after years in the cold. And Grayson came back every day, sometimes with flowers, sometimes with books, but always with time and attention, listening like she was the only sound in the world. And one day, under the birch tree by her fence, he got down on one knee and asked, "Will you build a quiet forever with me?" And she, trembling, said yes, not because she felt she deserved it, but because for once someone saw her whole, not as potential, not as charity, but as the answer to a promise. And their wedding was small, but the church overflowed, not because of the guests, but because of the tension, the hushed disbelief, the envy that clung to the pews like fog. And even as she walked down the aisle in a gown she'd sewn herself, there were smirks in the shadows, whispers like poison. Why her? He could have had anyone. But Grayson never looked away, not once, and when the pastor said, "Do you take this woman?" Grayson interrupted with, "I'd take her in every lifetime." And the silence that followed was not just shock. It was the moment the town realized they had never seen Marian clearly, only through the lens of their own prejudice. And though some apologized and others stayed bitter, Marian never raised her voice or her chin. She simply lived, loved Grayson fiercely, raised his sister's orphan children like her own, turned their ranch into a haven where the lost and lonely were fed. And over time, the story of the girl nobody wanted became the legend of the woman everyone admired. And when asked once during an interview how she handled the cruel things people said about her, she answered, "I wasn't made to fit their eyes, I was made to be seen by the one who mattered." And Grayson, standing beside her with silver in his beard, nodded and whispered, "And I see you still?" And though years passed and storms came and loved ones died, Marian's love story never faded, because it wasn't built on beauty that wilted or charm that faded. It was built on words sent in faith, a heart that stayed kind when the world was cruel, and the courage to believe that even the softest woman could shape a man's fate. And in her final days, as she lay beneath a quilt made from pieces of the first dress she ever sewed, Grayson held her hand and said, "You stitched me back together, Marian." And she smiled through pain and whispered, "And you showed me I was never broken." And when she passed, the entire valley wept, not for a seamstress or a war bride or a woman who once was mocked, but for the soul that taught them what real love looked like when it wore an unexpected shape, spoke in soft tones and arrived without apology.